My name is Clara Monroe. I'm a pediatric trauma nurse from Asheville, North Carolina. And the night I almost lost everything didn't begin with a siren or a scream, it began with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, it suffocates. It was 11:52 p.m. I remember the exact minute because I was staring at the glowing red digits of my phone, debating whether to go back inside or keep breathing in the cold April air. My husband, Jack Monroe, was inside that hospital clinging to what little time he had left. A man who once climbed Blue Ridge trails barefoot and built bookshelves with his bare hands, now could barely lift a spoon. And I who'd saved other people's children with my steady hands, was powerless. I had just stepped out of his ICU room to scream. Not out loud, but the kind of scream that pushes against your chest and ribs until you feel like you might implode. My scrubs still smelled like antiseptic. My palms were damp fingers, curled tight nails digging into skin like anchors. That's when I heard it. 2 nurses, on break. Laughing softly, unaware that I was sitting behind the hedgerow outside the staff entrance. Yeah, Monroe in room 204. He looks just like that guy in Linwood, the one who owns the gas station off Route 12. Laughter. Seriously, it's uncanny. Same eyes, same crooked smile. It's freaky. My breath caught. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Linwood. A tiny town I'd passed exactly once on a rural community health rotation. Jack never mentioned anyone from Linwood. But then again, Jack never mentioned anyone. He had no family. Or so we thought. He was a foster kid. Raised by 3 different families in 2 different counties. All he ever told me was that he didn't even have a birth certificate until he was 7. I grew up unclaimed. He'd joke with a smile that always felt too easy to be real. But in that moment on that bench in the dark, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. Hope. It showed up like a thief in the night, uninvited, unwelcome, yet completely undeniable. Was it a coincidence? Maybe. People look alike all the time. But something inside me whispered louder than doubt. What if he's not alone? What if that stranger in Linwood is more than a stranger? The hook of that thought pulled me back from the edge. I stood up, palms still shaking. My mind was already racing, calculating shifts, distance, how to get there, what to say if I found him. I wasn't even sure who him was. But I knew one thing: I couldn't sit still while my husband's life bled away in silence. The machine said Jack had days, maybe a week. The transplant team said we had exhausted every registry, every option. Without a match, we're just managing comfort, the doctor had said. Comfort. As if watching him fade was a pillow and a warm blanket. I wasn't ready to manage comfort. I wanted to manage a miracle. So I walked back into his room, sat beside him, and stared at the man I had shared 9 years, 4 addresses, and 2 miscarriages with. The man who carved our initials into the old oak fence behind our first rental and made pancakes every Sunday morning, even when he hated pancakes. He was pale, his eyes sunken skin almost translucent, but he smiled. God, he still smiled when he saw me. Hey you, he rasped. You okay? I kissed his forehead and whispered, yeah, just needed a little air. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until I knew. Not until I was sure I wouldn't be handing him hope that would shatter in his hands. If you've ever clung to a thread so thin it could cut you, if you've ever felt like the universe was done listening to your prayers, leave a like and stay with me. Because this story doesn't end in that hospital room. It begins with one sentence whispered by strangers and everything it changed. And I promise you, you'll want to hear what came next. Jack wasn't just my husband. He was my home. You know how some people say their partner is their best friend? Jack was more than that. He was the kind of man who'd stop mid-sentence to pick up a ladybug crawling across the kitchen counter because they bring good luck Clara. The kind who'd build you a bookshelf, then label each shelf by genre because he remembered that conversation you had about organizing by vibe, not alphabet. Before the beeping monitors and IV poles, Jack was the guy who could make a grocery run feel like a date. He'd show up at my nursing station with a gas station bouquet and a Dr. Pepper grin wide and say, "Let's get out of here before life notices." He had this energy, magnetic, but quiet like a bonfire in the woods. You never saw it from the road, but once you found it, you never wanted to leave. I remember the day he first passed out. It was barely a month after his 38th birthday. We had just finished building raised garden beds in our backyard. Jack had spent the day hauling lumber, joking about how we'd grow the world's smallest watermelon patch. By sunset, he looked pale but laughed it off. "I'm just out of shape," he said, wiping his forehead. That night, he collapsed in the shower. I was brushing my teeth when I heard the thud. I ran in and found him slumped, his lips faintly blue water pouring down his back. My nurse instincts kicked in, but so did the panic. I got him to the ER. Blood work scans, tests. Aplastic anemia. The words didn't register at first. I knew the term, of course, I'd seen it in textbooks and charts. But when the doctor looked at me, eyes heavy, and said, "His bone marrow is shutting down," I felt like I'd been gutted. They explained that without a bone marrow transplant, Jack's body wouldn't survive. His cells weren't reproducing. No red blood cells, no white blood cells, no platelets. It was like his own body had declared mutiny. "Do you have any siblings?" the hematologist asked him gently. Jack shook his head. "No family, not really." That was the hardest part. He wasn't being modest. Jack truly had no one. No known relatives, no mother to call, no brother to test. He had spent his childhood in a system designed to move kids, not root them. He bounced between foster homes, never adopted, never told the full story of where he came from. It always baffled me how someone with such an empty origin could grow into a man so full of love. We registered with the National Donor Database. We told friends, shared his story, even got a local paper to run a feature on a craftsman in need. But weeks passed, then months, and Jack got weaker. I watched him struggle to hold a spoon, then watched as he couldn't hold my hand without trembling. He never complained. "I've lived a good life, Clara," he whispered one night as I sat curled next to him on the hospital bed. "Don't talk like that," I said. He just smiled. "I'm not afraid, not of dying. I'm afraid you'll be alone again." That broke me, because I wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not to him. Not to the man who stayed with me through every loss, who cried with me on the bathroom floor when our second IVF failed, who whispered, "Maybe it's not children we're meant to raise. Maybe it's each other." Jack had raised me in ways I didn't know I needed. He had taught me to slow down, to see beauty in utility, to love without armor. And now he was fading. But after what I heard that night, those nurses' voices talking about a man in Linwood, I couldn't sit still. I couldn't bury the man I loved without chasing down even the faintest echo of family. Because if you've ever watched someone you love disappear slowly, cell by cell, then you know hope doesn't need evidence. It just needs a spark. And I was ready to run toward it with everything I had. It had been 189 days since Jack's diagnosis. I knew because I'd marked each one in my planner with a red dot, as if somehow that made the time less cruel, less fast. But it hadn't. 6 months ago, we were planning to adopt a puppy from a rescue farm 2 towns over. We were talking about switching our patio lights to solar-powered ones. Jack had just been commissioned to build a dining table for a new restaurant opening downtown, solid oak 7 feet long with inlaid walnut trim. He was so excited about the grain pattern that he dragged me out of bed one morning just to look at it in the garage. That life feels like a photograph now. Frozen, faded, fragile. Everything changed that Tuesday morning. Jack had come into the kitchen pale and silent. He dropped the milk jug. When I rushed to help, he brushed me off with a weak smile. "Just clumsy," he said. But his lips were dry, his nails pale. And when he bent down to pick up the broken glass, I saw it. A bruise. Not purple, but almost black, spreading across his forearm like a dark bloom. I scheduled a blood panel. He resisted. "I'm just tired," he kept saying. But I pushed. I had to, and I wish I hadn't been right. The labs came back abnormal, hemoglobin dangerously low, platelets almost non-existent. His white count couldn't fight off a sneeze, much less an infection. Within a week, we were admitted to University Medical in Raleigh. A team of hematologists, oncologists, and transplant coordinators surrounded us with clipboards, careful expressions, and terms that danced between terrifying and incomprehensible. Aplastic anemia isn't like leukemia. There's no tumor, no lump to cut out. It's the quiet collapse of the body's entire production line. The factory shuts down. No blood, no defense, no healing. And it doesn't wait. They tried immunosuppressants, growth factors, transfusions. We ran through every FDA-approved protocol. And for a moment, it looked like he was stabilizing. But then came the fever. 102.9 degrees, then 104. Within 48 hours, Jack was in ICU. I tried to be his wife and his nurse at the same time, changing his bedding, checking his IV, coordinating his labs. But at 3:07 one morning, I broke. I locked myself in the staff supply closet and sobbed next to a stack of saline bags. It felt like I was drowning inside my own profession. That's when the transplant coordinator gave us the news that shattered what little hope I had left. "There are no matches in the National Registry," she said softly. "We've run a full search across US, Canada, Europe. No viable donors, not even close." I remember Jack's face when he heard it. He didn't flinch, he didn't cry. He just closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them and looked at me. "I'm sorry," he said, as if any of this had been his fault. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to scream at the universe for making this kind, humble man fight for every ounce of breath while monsters roamed free. But I didn't. I just held his hand and said the only thing I could. "We're not done yet." He smiled weak and slow. "You always say that." And I did, because I refused to believe the end had been written. So when I heard those two nurses mention Linwood, it didn't matter how slim the odds were. It didn't matter that Jack had sworn he had no siblings, no blood relatives. Because when you've tried everything else, even coincidence feels like a calling. That night I went home, pulled up Google Maps, and typed Linwood, North Carolina. Population 2, 617, 1 gas station, 1 family-owned diner, a whole lot of farmland. It was only 47 miles away. I stared at the screen, heart thudding in my chest. If someone out there looked like Jack, shared his eyes, his smile, then I needed to see him. I needed to look that man in the face and ask the question that could save my husband's life. "Do you know who you are? And more importantly, do you know who he is to you?" The next morning, I didn't ask for permission. I filed for emergency leave. I didn't even change out of my Navy scrubs. I marched straight into my supervisor's office at 6:15 a.m. Eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from too much caffeine and too little sleep. She looked at me for half a second and didn't ask a thing. Just nodded, signed the form, and said, "Go." I packed a bag with 1 change of clothes, a bottle of Advil, Jack's latest lab results, and the photo we took last summer at Lake James. His arm around me, sunglasses on, smile, barely hiding the sunburn peeling at the edge of his nose. I didn't know who I was looking for, only that he might look like that. Linwood was a dot on the map. You blink and miss it. As I drove the winding 2-lane roads past barns with chipped paint and picket fences, half swallowed by kudzu, I started rehearsing what I might say. "Hi, sorry to bother you, but do you have a brother?" "No." "Excuse me, do you know anyone who might have been adopted out of the system around 1983? Ridiculous. All I really had was a photograph and a gut instinct. But in that moment, that was enough. As I entered Linwood, the GPS died. No signal. Of course. I pulled into the only gas station in town, a single pump station with faded red signage and a cooler humming out front stocked with root beer and boiled peanuts. A man in his 60s sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. When I walked in, he looked up slowly, his gaze calm but curious. I forced a polite smile. "Hi, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I'm looking for someone. I don't know his name, but people say he looks like this." I slid the photo across the counter. The man squinted, then tilted his head. "That your husband?" I nodded. "Yes." "Well," he said, scratching the side of his neck, "that sure as hell looks like Luke Dawson. Lives out off Granger Road. Works on bikes and carburetors. Keeps to himself mostly." My chest tightened. Do you know if he has any family?" The man shrugged. "Don't think so. He's been around a long while. Always seemed like a loner. But he's a good guy. Helped me fix my John Deere last fall." I thanked him, scribbled the directions, and drove. The road turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. I passed a field of soy, then a rusting water tower. Finally, I saw it, an old ranch-style home paint peeling, 1 truck in the drive dog, on the porch tail wagging. I sat in my car for at least 5 minutes, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. This could be the man, or it could be nothing. But if there was even a sliver of a chance, I got out, walked up the path, knocked. Once, twice. The door opened with a slow creak, and there he was. Luke Dawson stood about 6'2", lean but broad grease on his jeans hands, scarred from years of work. But it wasn't his frame or his posture that made me gasp, it was his eyes. Ocean blue, piercing, familiar. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice cautious. I swallowed. "This is going to sound insane," I said, holding up the photo. "But this is my husband, Jack Monroe. He's dying, and people said you looked like him." Luke stared at the image, for a long time, then longer. He stepped back. "Let me in." We sat at his tiny kitchen table, wood-chipped coffee rings on the surface, and I explained everything. Jack's illness, the diagnosis, the failed matches, the whisper I'd overheard that led me here. And when I finished, Luke leaned back, rubbed his jaw, and said the words that shifted the earth beneath me. My mom left a baby at the hospital back in '83, said she wasn't going to raise another mouth. I was 6. I always wondered what happened to him. I couldn't breathe. Luke nodded slowly. If Jack's that baby, if he's my brother. He paused, looked me square in the eye. Then I'm gonna help save his life. I didn't cry right away. Not when Luke said the words I'd clung to in silence for days. Not when he stood up from that splintered kitchen chair and walked toward the hallway like he had a mission to prepare for. I didn't even cry when he reached into an old tin box and pulled out a yellowed envelope marked Discharge Papers 1983 in shaky cursive. But when he turned back to me, held that envelope between grease-stained fingers and whispered, I always hoped I'd find him someday, just not like this. My chest cracked wide open. That's when I let myself fall apart. Because for 6 months I'd been strong. Strong for Jack, strong for nurses, strong for neighbors' insurance calls, transplant coordinators. I'd held every piece of our life together with trembling fingers and a brittle smile. But now here was a man I didn't know offering hope not just with his words but with his blood. And I could finally exhale. Luke didn't need convincing. There was no resistance, no fear, just a quiet acceptance like he had known deep down that one day a knock would come with a truth too big to ignore. I asked gently, Are you sure? This is a major procedure. The testing, the recovery, it's not nothing. He stared at the photo of Jack again, then met my gaze. You said he's got no one else, right? I nodded. Then I guess he's got me now. We didn't waste time. I called the transplant coordinator from my car. She was stunned when I explained. She asked 1,000 questions, none of which I had answers for. But when she heard that Luke was ready to be tested immediately, her tone changed. We'll expedite everything, she said. But Clara, if he's not a match? I know, I whispered, I know. Luke packed a duffel in under 5 minutes. No hesitation. No checklist. Just grabbed his keys, a spare hoodie, and a travel mug full of black coffee. Before we pulled out of the gravel driveway, he stopped to lock the front door and scratch behind the ears of the old mutt on the porch. You watch the place, Buck, he murmured. Then we were off. The ride back to Raleigh was quiet at first. Just the hum of tires and the occasional cough from the old engine. But after an hour, Luke spoke. Tell me about him. Jack, what's he like? I smiled despite the weight in my chest. He laughs with his whole face. He hates olives, but loves peach cobbler. He cries during commercials and rewatches the same woodworking YouTube videos on loop. He once built a bookshelf because I said our apartment was starting to feel like a library, and then labeled the shelves based on mood. Luke chuckled. Sounds like a weird dude. He's the best man I've ever met. Luke didn't respond for a long time, but then softly he said, If I get to meet him, I hope he thinks the same about me. We pulled into the hospital lot as the sun began to set behind the high-rises. That golden hour glow poured over the glass windows like honey, and for a second, just a second, I imagined what it would feel like to walk in there with good news for once. A nurse met us at the entrance and whisked Luke away for pre-screening and blood draws. I stayed back, heart pounding in my ears. Every second felt like a lifetime. But this time waiting didn't feel like dying. It felt like believing. If you've ever taken a leap based on nothing but instinct, if you've ever looked at a stranger and prayed they might save someone you love, then maybe you know what I felt that night. And if this story has made your heart hold its breath even for a second, share it. Let someone know. Because hope is a chain reaction. And maybe your click, your comment, your voice keeps someone else from giving up tonight. Jack was asleep when I walked back into his room. Tubes trailed from his arms like tangled threads, and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. But even in sleep, his face held the same quiet defiance like a man daring the universe to take him without a fight. I didn't wake him. I just sat beside his bed, held his hand, and watched the sun dip below the city skyline outside his window. The world kept turning. People kept living. And here I was, in a room full of silence, trying to believe in a miracle. 2 hours later, the transplant coordinator returned. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me the way people do when they're afraid their words might shatter something fragile. Then she said it. He's a partial match. A good one. My breath caught. Not perfect, she clarified, but strong enough to proceed. I blinked, trying to absorb the meaning behind those words. For the first time in months, the doctor didn't use phrases like palliative care or symptom management. She said, "Proceed." Jack stirred a little in his sleep, turning his head slightly in my direction, and I squeezed his fingers instinctively. This might actually work. They scheduled further compatibility testing fast-tracked due to Jack's condition. Luke stayed at a nearby guest facility reserved for transplant families. I offered him our spare bedroom back at the house, but he refused gently. "Let me stay close, just in case." Over the next few days, the doctors ran every test imaginable. Cross-matches, antigen analysis, viability scores. Luke endured endless needle pokes, scans, and a donor prep protocol that would have scared most people off. But not him. I watched him interact with nurses, shy, quiet, never complaining. I caught glimpses of Jack in him, the way he tilted his head when listening, how his laugh was low and hesitant, like he wasn't used to being heard. One evening, as we sat in the hospital cafeteria sipping lukewarm coffee, Luke spoke without looking up. I kept wondering why I never went looking for him, why I didn't try harder. But I think part of me was afraid of what I'd find. I stayed silent, letting him finish. "I've made mistakes, Clara. I've lived a rough life. Bar fights, jail once, never stayed long in one place. I figured, if I ever did have family out there, they'd be better off not knowing me." I reached across the table, covered his calloused hand with mine. "You showed up, that's what matters." He looked at me, then really looked. "You think he'll want to know me?" I smiled softly. "Jack's been searching his whole life for someone who feels like blood. I think he'll see you before you even speak." 2 days later, we brought Luke into Jack's room. Jack was awake, propped up by pillows, pale but alert. When he saw me enter with Luke behind me, his brows furrowed slightly. Then his gaze locked onto Luke's face. They stared at each other like two mirrors trying to understand their own reflections. Jack's lips parted. "Do I know you?" Luke stepped forward, his voice cracked. "I think I'm your brother." Jack didn't speak. His eyes filled instantly, and he looked at me like he needed help understanding what was happening, like this moment wasn't real. And then, without a word, he reached out a trembling hand. Luke took it. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. Something ancient and unspoken passed between them. Recognition, grief, maybe even forgiveness for the years they never knew they'd lost. I stepped out of the room, closed the door behind me, and leaned against the wall. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe. Maybe we weren't losing Jack. Maybe we were about to find something much bigger than any of us ever expected. The day of the transplant felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, silent, steep, and irreversible. There was no turning back, no way to know what would come next. Only the thin thread of a medical procedure connecting life to maybe life. Hope to maybe loss. Jack was prepped before dawn. He didn't sleep much the night before, and neither did I. He kept turning to look at Luke, who'd been allowed to stay in the room overnight in a battered recliner chair. "You snore," Jack mumbled, that morning voice barely audible. Luke smirked. "I haven't shared a room since juvie, so I'm out of practice." The joke hung in the air for a moment, and then both men chuckled. It was fragile and awkward, like two people learning how to belong to each other again. Or maybe for the first time. The transplant team moved quickly. The disease had accelerated in Jack's body, and his blood counts were dangerously low. They didn't want to wait. Luke was a partial match, but the best they had. The risks were clear: graft failure, infection, rejection. But the alternative was far worse. The night before, Luke had pulled me aside. We stood in the hallway outside Jack's room, the hospital lights buzzing softly overhead. "You trust them?" he asked, nodding toward the transplant team. "I do," I said. "They've done everything right. Now we just have to hope his body says yes." Luke rubbed the back of his neck. "I never thought I'd be saving someone I didn't even know existed 2 weeks ago." I looked at him, this man who had grown up thinking he was alone, who had gotten into fights, lost jobs, lived in and out of borrowed lives, and said, "Maybe you weren't meant to know until now. Maybe this is why you're still standing." That morning they took Luke first. I waited in the sterile lounge while he underwent marrow extraction. I paced, chewed the skin around my thumbnail, made silent bargains with every higher power I could name. The procedure took hours. They harvested what they needed, then whisked the stem cells away while I sat next to Jack, holding his cold, damp hand. He didn't speak much, just watched me. "You okay?" he finally whispered. I smiled, trying to be. Jack blinked slowly. "Did you ever think it would turn out like this? Finding a brother in the 11th hour?" I shook my head. "Not even in my wildest dreams." Jack's lip twitched. "I thought I was going to die alone." I leaned forward. "You were never alone. The transplant itself went quickly, an infusion of hope in a clear plastic bag. The nurse hung it like any other IV, but everyone in the room knew it wasn't ordinary. It was a second chance flowing cell by microscopic cell into his veins. As it began, I looked at Jack. "Let it in," I whispered. He nodded, tears in his eyes. Later that evening, Luke came by walking slower than usual, his face pale but proud. He stood by the foot of Jack's bed and grinned weakly. "Never thought I'd give part of my spine to a guy I met last week," he said. "But I guess family makes you do weird things." Jack smiled and held out a hand. Luke took it without hesitation. "I owe you everything," Jack whispered. "Nah," Luke replied, eyes shining. "You owe me a beer and a whole lot of awkward Thanksgiving dinners." That night we sat in the room together, three souls who should have never found each other, somehow anchored now by blood and choice. Outside the hospital, rain tapped the windows in steady rhythm. But inside, something had shifted. Not just Jack's prognosis. Our entire world. And if you've ever believed even just once that people can still show up for each other in the moments that matter most, share this story. Tell someone. You never know when your voice might be the knock someone's been waiting for. If this part of the journey moved you, don't forget to leave a comment, hit that subscribe button, and stay with us. The story's not over, not even close. The hours after the transplant passed in a strange kind of silence, not empty, not heavy, but watchful, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. I sat in the recliner next to Jack's bed, eyes fixed on the steady flow of stem cells dripping into his body. Each drop felt like a whispered promise: stay, heal, live. Jack slept, his chest rising in slow, shallow breaths. Luke had returned to the recovery suite to rest, though I doubted he was sleeping. The procedure had left him sore and tired, but not broken. In some odd way, he looked lighter than before, like giving a part of himself had returned something he didn't know he'd lost. Over the next 2 days we watched and waited. The nurses monitored vitals hourly. I studied every beep, every chart, every fluctuation in Jack's blood pressure, like it was a message written just for me. There were no guarantees, only statistics and protocols. But when Jack opened his eyes and smiled on the morning of day 3, I felt the first tremor of hope settle deep in my chest. His voice was hoarse. "Coffee." I laughed. "They won't let you have caffeine for another week." "Tragic," he whispered. But that one word, tragic, spoken with a trace of humor, meant more to me than any lab result. It meant Jack was still Jack, and he was fighting. By the end of the week, his white cell count had begun to rise. Not dramatically, but enough for the doctors to nod with cautious optimism. His skin, once paper-thin and gray, showed the faintest hint of color. He even cracked a joke about the hospital's chicken pot pie, which in his words might be part of the problem, not the cure. Luke visited daily. Sometimes he brought sandwiches, sometimes coffee. Once he brought a photo, old grainy dog-eared, of him as a kid, standing barefoot on a cracked driveway beside a beat-up tricycle. He handed it to Jack with an awkward shrug. "Thought you might want to see what you missed," he said. Jack held the photo like it was sacred. They didn't talk much, at least not about the past. But there was a quiet companionship that began to grow between them. The kind that doesn't need many words. Shared DNA, shared silence, shared second chances. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the blinds and painted golden lines across the hospital tile, Luke pulled something from his jacket pocket, a pocket knife. The handle was worn smooth from time initials carved into the wood JD. "My dad's," he said quietly. "Only thing I have from him. He gave it to me before he disappeared. Thought it belonged with you now, too." Jack stared at the knife for a long time. Then carefully, with fingers still trembling from weakness, he reached out and took it. His voice cracked. "Thank you." Luke nodded, looked away. "Don't make a big deal out of it." I smiled through tears, too late. That evening, as I helped Jack settle back into his bed, he looked at me and whispered, "I never thought I'd have a brother." I brushed the hair off his forehead. "You never thought you'd survive this far either." He smiled faintly. "Guess life's full of surprises?" And in that moment, I believed it. Not because a miracle had dropped from the sky, but because we had built it step by painful step, decision by terrifying decision, stranger by stranger, becoming family. Sometimes love doesn't show up as fireworks. Sometimes it's a man handing over the last thing he has from his father to a brother he never knew. Sometimes it's a whispered joke about pot pie, or a stubborn heartbeat refusing to stop. We weren't through yet. The road ahead was still steep: recovery, isolation, risk. but the worst of the darkness had passed. Now, we had a flashlight. The first time Jack stood up after the transplant, the entire room held its breath. It was day 9. His muscles had withered and his knees wobbled like wet paper, but his fingers wrapped around the walker with quiet determination. And when the physical therapist gave the signal, Jack pushed himself upright. I'd seen babies take their first steps with more grace, but none with more grit. Luke and I watched from across the room, me gripping the arm of the recliner, Luke with his arms crossed, jaw clenched tight. Jack shuffled forward barely half a foot, but every inch looked like a mile carved from granite. Then he glanced up and gave us that crooked smile I hadn't seen in weeks. "I still got it," he whispered. Luke snorted. "Define it." Jack laughed, a dry, crackling sound, but real. That sound alone made the last 10 days worth every needle, every sleepless hour, every terrifying what if. Each morning, Jack grew a little stronger. His color returned inch by inch. His blood counts stabilized, and the transplant team began whispering words like responding well and encouraging markers. Luke stayed in the hospital guest wing, refusing to leave. Some nights I found him dozing on the pull-out cot just outside Jack's room, arms folded across his chest, a half-finished crossword puzzle on his lap. He never asked for thanks, never expected praise. He just showed up. One night, Jack was well enough to sit up for a movie. I streamed an old comedy on my tablet and balanced it between pillows at the end of the bed. Luke joined us, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't interested. But by the second scene, he was chuckling under his breath like the rest of us. Then during a lull in the dialogue, Jack turned toward his brother. "Why didn't you look for me?" The room went still. Luke stared at the screen for a moment, then slowly shifted his gaze to Jack. "I did," he said. "Not hard enough, not for long, but I did. I was 16 when I learned the truth. That mom left a baby at the hospital. I was in juvie by then, had nothing to offer, no way to find you. Then life happened, and I got scared." Jack blinked. "Scared of what?" Luke exhaled. "That you'd hate me, or worse, that you'd be better off never knowing me existed." The silence between them stretched like a tightrope. Jack looked down at his hands, fingers still pale but steady now. "You were wrong." Luke's voice cracked. "Yeah, I know." "No," Jack said, firmer this time. I needed you. My whole life I didn't even know what was missing until you walked through that door." My throat tightened. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just nodded as if acknowledging something sacred had passed between them. Something men like them rarely name but never forget. That weekend, the doctors cleared Jack for limited walks around the hospital garden. I wheeled him outside into the crisp November air, and Luke followed behind us, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, boots crunching across the pebbled path. The trees had turned amber copper flame, and sunlight filtered through the branches like stained glass. Jack reached for my hand. "This doesn't feel real," he whispered. I squeezed his fingers gently. "It is. You're here. You're healing." He looked over at Luke, who was watching a bird hop across the stone wall nearby. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life wondering where I came from," Jack said. "And now I have a brother who gave me a future." Luke didn't turn. "Don't get sentimental. You still owe me lunch." Jack grinned. "I owe you more than that." "Yeah, well, I'll take ribs and a cold beer to start." They both laughed. And I stood between them, heartful, realizing that somehow, through fate or coincidence or divine orchestration, we'd been given more than just a chance to survive. We'd been given the chance to rewrite what family means. 2 weeks after the transplant, Jack came home. Well, technically, we all came home. Luke followed us down the winding road from Raleigh to Asheville in his beat-up Ford pickup, its muffler humming like an old harmonica. He hadn't asked for an invitation. He didn't need one. When I looked in the rearview mirror and saw his truck behind us the whole way, I knew he wasn't going anywhere. Jack leaned his head against the window beside me, his breath fogging up the glass every few seconds. He was still fragile, still fatigued, but alive. That one word carried more weight than anything else in the world. When we pulled into the driveway, Jack's eyes shimmered. The house hadn't changed much, still the cedar deck he built 3 summers ago. Still the bird feeder he swore the squirrels were conspiring against. Still the little patch of garden we'd planted, but never truly tended. But the energy had shifted. It felt fuller, like the house had been holding its breath and was finally allowed to exhale. I helped Jack to the porch where he paused to touch the banister he'd sanded with his own hands. Luke stood awkwardly behind us, carrying the duffel bag he'd refused to let me help with. Inside, everything was quiet. The same mismatched mugs, the same framed photos. the same chair Jack had once carved my initials into after a bottle of wine and a dare. Except now Luke was here. And suddenly our home wasn't just the two of us. It took a while to find the rhythm. Luke was rough around the edges. He left tools on the kitchen counter, burned bacon with alarming frequency, and sometimes went quiet mid-conversation, as if memories were tugging him backward. But Jack never judged, never corrected, just laughed and adjusted. And slowly I watched the two of them build something neither of them had before, a brotherhood shaped not by shared childhood, but by shared survival. One night a week after we came home, Jack pulled me onto the porch. A new rocking chair sat beside his old one. The wood was still raw, the legs uneven, but the sentiment was unmistakable. "I didn't make this," he said softly. "Luke did." I ran my fingers across the armrest. "It's beautiful." He smiled. He said, "It's crooked like all the good things in life." We sat in silence, the stars stretching above us like sequins sewn onto midnight. Then Jack turned to me, his voice quiet. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't made it. If you hadn't heard those nurses talking. If you hadn't chased that thread." I didn't answer right away. My eyes welled. "And I wonder," he continued, "how many people give up 1 second too soon. One step before the miracle." His words sank deep like a stone in still water. If you've ever stood on the edge of giving up, if you've ever thought the road was too long, too dark, too hopeless, I need you to hear this. Don't stop walking. Because sometimes miracles don't come crashing through the front door. Sometimes they knock quietly from a dusty porch, 2 towns over, wearing grease-stained jeans, and carrying nothing but an old pocket knife and a shared pair of blue eyes. And when they do, you better let them in. If this part of our story reached something in you, if you've ever found light in the most unexpected place, share that moment in the comments. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if you're still with us, still walking this road, don't forget to subscribe, because the rest of the journey is just beginning. The first Sunday dinner we had as a trio was both awkward and unforgettable. I'd spent most of the day preparing it: meatloaf, Jack's favorite mashed potatoes, with roasted garlic, and a cherry cobbler that I accidentally overbaked, while distracted by Luke telling a story about crashing a tractor into a pond as a teenager. The house smelled like butter spice and something new belonging. We ate at the old oak table Jack had built during our first year in this home. Back then we thought we might fill those extra chairs with children. Life had other plans. But as I watched Jack and Luke pass around dinner rolls and trade sarcastic jabs over who was the better cook, I realized this table was full in a way I never expected. Luke, who once claimed he didn't know how to be anyone's family now, leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, letting Jack finish his sentence for him. Jack, whose silence used to carry the weight of a lonely past, now filled the room with stories I'd never even heard before. And me, I finally let myself laugh without watching the clock. After dessert, Luke surprised us both by pulling out a weathered envelope and sliding it across the table toward Jack. "What's this?" Jack asked. Luke shrugged. "Just some pieces, letters, things I found when I started digging into where Mom had been after she left." Jack hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside were torn notes, an old photo of a woman I didn't recognize, and a hospital tag labeled simply Baby Dawson, 08/30/1983, his birth date. Jack stared at it for a long time. His eyes didn't move, but his hands trembled. She named me." Luke nodded. "Didn't tell me much back then, but yeah, she gave you a name, then gave you away." We sat in silence, each of us holding our own version of that sentence. Then Jack exhaled deep and slow. "I used to think I was a mistake," he said. "That maybe I didn't deserve to be claimed. That's why I never tried to find anyone. I figured, if I was meant to be found, someone would have come looking." Luke's face stiffened. "I should have come sooner." "No," Jack said, meeting his brother's eyes. "You came when I needed you most." They didn't hug, didn't cry. But in that moment, something changed. The air in the room shifted from regret to recognition, from what was lost to what had been restored. Later that night, while Jack napped in the living room and the quiet hum of the dishwasher filled the house, Luke stood beside me in the kitchen. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "Do you think Jack really forgives me for not knowing, for not coming sooner?" I dried my hands and turned to him. "Luke, forgiveness isn't about timing. It's about showing up. You didn't just show up, you stayed." He nodded, slowly processing that. Then quietly he added, "I never knew what family looked like. Not really, but it's better than anything I could have imagined." I smiled. "Yeah, me too." We stood there for a while, two people who had walked through completely different kinds of grief, now building something solid out of survival. The next morning, Jack handed Luke a folded napkin with a note scribbled in blue ink. It read, "You didn't save my life, you gave it back to me." Luke didn't say anything. He just folded the napkin, slid it into his pocket, and clapped his brother's shoulder like he'd always belonged there. And if you've ever found family in an unexpected place, if someone has shown up for you when you needed them most, take a second to tell us in the comments. Your story might be the hope someone else is searching for. And if you believe in second chances and healing in the quiet strength of showing up, don't forget to subscribe. This story has more chapters, and maybe so does yours. The holidays arrived slower that year, like the season itself was trying to be gentle. Asheville's crisp winter air drifted through the bare trees outside our windows, and the neighborhood twinkled with lights that felt almost too bright after the months we'd spent in fluorescent hospital halls. Jack had recovered enough to spend afternoons in the garage again, though instead of building furniture, he mostly organized tools and muttered about how Luke didn't know a lathe from a hole in the ground. Luke pretended to be insulted, but I knew he liked the time together. They'd grown into a rhythm, two men stitching something new over shared silences and half-told stories. One Saturday morning, I found them sitting side by side on the front porch, Jack in his flannel robe, Luke nursing a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. Between them sat a wooden box. "What's this?" I asked. Jack smiled faintly. "Our first co-project." I stepped closer and knelt to inspect it. The box was simple but carefully crafted walnut panels with dovetail joints and a brass clasp. Etched into the lid were two sets of initials, JM and LD. Luke shifted uncomfortably. We figured, it's time we had something to pass down. To who? I asked softly. Jack looked at me, his eyes steady. "We don't know yet, but maybe someday. Maybe to someone who feels like they came into the world too late." I felt a lump rise in my throat. That same afternoon, we drove out to a holiday potluck in a nearby town. Nothing big, just neighbors and friends from Jack's old workshop days. It was the first social thing we'd done since the transplant, and Jack had insisted on bringing a pumpkin pie he'd tried and failed to bake. "Looks like a crime scene," Luke had commented, examining the cracked crust. Jack grinned. "It's rustic." As we pulled into the community center lot, something caught my eye. A folding table stacked with cards and letters. A hand-drawn sign taped above read, "Messages of Hope." Curious, we approached. A woman in a red knit sweater offered us pens. "Write something for someone who might need it," she said. A line of encouragement. A reminder they're not alone. Jack took a card, paused for a long moment, then began to write. When he was done, he handed it to me. It read, "You may think no one's coming for you, but someone is. They just haven't heard your story yet. Don't stop waiting." I looked at him, the man I almost lost, and thought about the stranger who'd become his brother. I thought about the whispers that led me to a town I hadn't visited in years, to a man holding a piece of Jack's soul without knowing it. The universe hadn't abandoned us, it had simply taken the long way around. Luke came up behind us, then holding two plates piled high with ham and cornbread stuffing. "Jack said you were crying," he said dryly. "Want some carbs about it?" I laughed, swiping at my cheek. "You're an emotional support casserole." Damn right. That night back home, we lit a fire in the backyard. Jack leaned against me on the bench while Luke poked at the logs with a stick like a grown-up Boy Scout. It wasn't perfect. It was chilly. The pie had been terrible. Luke had offended an elderly woman by calling her sweater aggressively festive. But I wouldn't have traded that night for anything. As the flames crackled, Jack looked at me and whispered, "I used to think I'd never feel whole." "You are," I said. "And not because you were fixed, but because you found the piece that was missing. If you've ever felt broken, if you've ever believed a part of you might be lost forever, know this healing doesn't always look like getting back what you had. Sometimes it's finding what you didn't know you needed." And if this resonates with you, leave a comment. Let us know what piece of your story found its way home, and if you haven't yet, subscribe. Because healing takes time, and maybe, just maybe, we can walk that road together. By January, Jack was back in the garage, not just organizing, but building again. It started with a coat rack. Nothing fancy. Just pine wood, a few hooks, and a small engraving at the top that read, "This house welcomes all who stay." But the way he moved, the measured sanding, the care in each screw, it was like watching someone reintroduce themselves to the life they almost left behind. Luke hovered nearby, pretending not to be impressed. He was supposed to be helping, but mostly he just handed Jack tools and offered color commentary like, "You're putting that shelf about a quarter inch too sentimental." Jack never got defensive. He'd just shake his head and mutter, Remind me again why I kept you alive. Luke would grin. Because you missed having someone to argue with. They'd grown into brothers, not through blood tests, but through shared days, shared routines. Luke learned to make Jack's favorite coffee. Jack learned that Luke had a secret obsession with bad sci-fi movies. They fought over parking spots and joked about who would survive longer in the wilderness. But the moment I knew this wasn't just temporary, that Luke wasn't just a guest in our home or a chapter in our recovery, was the night of the storm. It was late January. Ice blanketed the trees outside, and the power flickered off around 11 p.m. Jack was asleep, still recovering, and I was in the kitchen boiling water over a camping stove when I heard a thump from the living room. I rushed in to find Jack hunched forward, dizzy and pale. Before I could even react, Luke was there, sliding one arm under Jack's shoulders, lifting him gently, guiding him to the couch. "Easy," he said softly. "You're okay." Jack looked dazed, dizzy, just got up too fast. Luke didn't panic. He grabbed a blanket, a glass of water, and kept his voice calm the whole time. Later, when Jack was settled and breathing steady again, Luke sat beside me on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the unlit fireplace. "I used to freeze when things went wrong," he said quietly. "Growing up, everything was chaos. You either ran or got hit. But tonight I didn't think. I just moved." I put a hand on his shoulder, because this time it mattered. He didn't look at me. This time, it was mine to protect. That hit something deep in me. Luke had always been a survivor, but now he was something else too, a guardian, a brother, a part of our foundation. The next morning, when the power returned and the world thawed slightly, Jack sat beside me on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, his breath steaming in the cold. "Did I ever tell you about the time Luke fixed my IV line better than the nurse did?" he asked, smirking. I raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." I woke up, the machine was beeping, and there he was reading the manual with his glasses halfway down his nose. Luke emerged from the garage at that moment, wiping his hands on a rag. And now he calls me Dr. Doom every time I walk into the room. We laughed, not because it was hilarious, but because laughter had become a new language between us, our way of saying we're still here. That afternoon, Luke pulled out a small box from under the truck seat. "I was going to wait," he said, handing it to Jack, "but I think now's the right time." Inside was a pocket knife, worn the blade, dulled initials scratched on the handle, T.D. Jack's father. The one neither of them had really known. "It was his," Luke said. "He gave it to me the day he left, said I'd know when to pass it on." Jack ran his fingers across the initials, then looked at Luke with eyes full of something I can't put into words. No tears, no speech, just a slow, steady nod. And I stood there, heart full, knowing that in a world built on broken promises, this moment was a vow kept. If someone's ever handed you something broken and trusted you to carry it forward, if you've ever taken a piece of history and turned it into healing, tell us. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Because we're not done telling this story, not even close. Spring came late that year. Maybe it was just us moving slower, noticing more. But the dogwoods didn't bloom on schedule, and the azaleas took their time like they had something to prove. Everything felt like it was waking up with caution, stretching toward a world that had cracked, but not broken. Jack was walking more now. Not far, just around the block, sometimes down to the corner store where the clerk always asked how he was doing, like it was a matter of national concern. His hair was growing back and soft and darker than before, like even his cells were starting over. Luke had officially moved in. We never talked about it like a decision, it just happened. One day his truck was in the driveway. The next his boots were by the door. Eventually I cleared out the old guest room closet without saying a word. He started fixing things too. Things we didn't even know were broken. The back porch light that had flickered for years. The kitchen drawer that never closed right. Even the bird feeder that always leaned sideways, now perfectly level. It was a quiet way of saying I'm not going anywhere. One Sunday afternoon, Jack and Luke stood in the backyard, surrounded by lumber sawdust, floating in the air like pollen. They were building something together, a bench, I think, or maybe a planter. It didn't matter. What mattered was the sound of them laughing. Real laughter, no weight behind it, just joy. I brought out lemonade and found them mid-debate about whether screws or dowels made for stronger joints. Luke turned to me, hand on his hip, mock offended. "Tell him dowels are more authentic." Jack shook his head. "Tell him screws don't crack when you breathe on them." I raised my hands in surrender. "I'm just the lemonade girl. Don't drag me into this." They grinned at each other, and I watched two men who had spent their lives on opposite sides of pain meet in the middle, with sawdust on their shirts and healing in their hands. That evening we hosted our first backyard dinner since Jack got sick. Just a few close friends, a string of lights, and a long table Luke and Jack had built together from reclaimed barnwood. Jack called it the table built from ruins. We sat under the stars, passing dishes and swapping stories. Luke, who once didn't speak much at all, told a ridiculous tale about getting chased by a goat when he was 13. Jack added dramatic flair with hand gestures. I laughed until my stomach hurt. At one point, our neighbor Clara raised a glass and said to found family. We all raised ours. Jack caught my gaze across the table and mouthed, "Thank you." After everyone left and the fire pit had burned down to embers, Jack and I sat on the porch while Luke played an old guitar he found at a thrift store. He wasn't great, but he didn't care, and that made it beautiful. Jack rested his head on my shoulder. "Can I tell you something?" he whispered. "Always." I thought I was going to die with no legacy. I turned to him. "You didn't." "I know," he said, nodding toward Luke. "He is." We fell into silence, the kind that doesn't need filling, just listening. And it hit me, Jack hadn't just survived. He had become someone's reason to keep going. And Luke, who had once drifted through life with his fists up, now stood steady in a home he helped rebuild. Together they weren't just healing, they were whole. And if you've ever found your way back from a place you thought was your end, if you've ever realized that what you built out of ashes was more beautiful than what came before, share that moment. Because someone needs to hear it, someone is still in the middle, and your story might just light their way. A year to the day after Jack's transplant, we drove back to Linwood. Not because we had to, but because we needed to. There's something sacred about returning to the place where your story split open, where fate took a left turn, and somehow against every odd led you to the miracle. The town hadn't changed much. The gas station still had the same faded sign. The same porch dog barked as we passed, but we weren't the same. Jack sat in the passenger seat, healthier now, his color back, his smile easy. Luke followed us in his truck windows down, arm resting casually out the window like someone who finally knew where he belonged. We pulled into a gravel drive at the edge of town, a small cabin, old but sturdy, nestled beneath a canopy of oaks. Luke had bought it with his savings and a small business loan he secured after months of paperwork and planning. It was going to be his garage, his home, and his way of anchoring himself to something permanent. "Thought I'd stop drifting," he said with a crooked grin. Jack walked the grounds slowly, his steps careful but sure. He paused beside the rusted mailbox, ran his fingers along the paint. "You think this is where we would have grown up?" he asked. Luke shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not, but this is where we get to start." Inside the house, the living room was bare except for a rocking chair. The same one Jack had carved for me during our first year of marriage, the one that had survived 3 moves of flood and a wildfire evacuation. Luke had quietly hauled it out of our garage and placed it here as a surprise. "I figured every good beginning needs something from the past, to remind you why you started," he said. We stood in silence for a moment, each of us taking in the weight of that sentence. Later that evening, the 3 of us sat outside as the sky turned copper and violet. Luke had built a fire pit out of reclaimed brick. Jack had brought a cooler of root beer and peach cobbler he insisted was edible this time. I brought an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. We flipped through pages of old Polaroids, weddings, birthdays, blurry shots from hiking trails. Then Luke pulled out a photo of his own. It was the one of his childhood. The cracked driveway, the tricycle, the absence of anyone else in the frame. Jack looked at it then at Luke and said softly, "You're not alone in the picture anymore." Luke didn't answer. He just smiled. As the fire crackled and the stars returned one by one, Jack leaned back and whispered, "I used to think survival was the goal. But now I know survival is just the doorway. What you do after, that's living." That line stuck with me. Because we didn't just survive. We built something. Something beautiful. Something unbreakable. Something ours. And if you've ever walked through fire and wondered if anything could grow again, if you've ever questioned whether healing was even possible, let this be your proof. Leave a comment, tell your story, or just say I'm still here. That alone is a victory. And if this journey has meant something to you, subscribe. Not for us, but for you. Because maybe the next story we tell will be the one that brings you home. I used to think healing looked like going back to how things were. Before the diagnosis, before the fear, before the silence and the beeping monitors and the endless nights in a hospital chair. But now I know that kind of healing doesn't exist. You don't go back. You go forward, changed. And maybe that's the point. Because if we had never broken open, we would have never known what was possible to rebuild. Jack didn't just survive his illness. He unearthed a brother, a part of himself he never knew was missing. Luke didn't just donate marrow, he stepped into a life he hadn't dared to imagine. And me, I stopped waiting for life to return to normal and started living in the kind of truth that doesn't apologize for its scars. We don't get to choose the storms that come for us, but we do get to choose what we build in their aftermath. So if you're standing in rubble right now, if everything familiar has fallen apart, don't run. Look around, because maybe the pieces left behind aren't fragments of what's lost. They're the blueprint for what comes next. And that next thing, it could be stronger, softer, truer than anything you've known before. You just have to stay long enough to see it take shape. If this story reminded you of someone you love, someone you've lost, or someone who helped you come back to life, tell us below. Your story matters, and you're not alone. Subscribe if you believe in second chances, in unexpected families, in the beautiful things we build when we refuse to give up. We're still here, and maybe so are you.